All right, we're heading into the last last section of the chapter 13, 14 um, area that we're looking at social 30. And we're looking at what does it mean to be an active citizen? What are the rights? What are the roles? And what are the responsibilities for citizens in order to take action? So, in other words, now that you've learned all these things that we've taught you, and also the information that you've learned just growing up, with your parents, with your family, with the people that you find important, with your exposure to media, news, etc. What now? What do you do now as a citizen of Canada? But listen to a couple of video clips I suggest that you watch that deal with, some people respond to citizenship with taking stands. Now, earlier in the previous lesson, I talked about pacifism and not taking part in war. Well, taking it a step further, there were certainly a number of anti-war movements that have taken part or taken place in the last century. I mean, I think in grade 11 and grade 10 we looked at what happened during World War I, World War II in Canada with the conscription crises, and then we have touched on Vietnam in Social 20, but this would be an example of citizenship and action, uh, you know, basically saying we're not going to take part in war, from a very famous athlete, kind of being the quintessential example of that. And that athlete was Muhammad Ali, born Cassius Clay, who, when he was at the height of his powers as the heavyweight boxing champion, not only did he have amazing athleticism, but he had charisma to back it up. He, at that point of his career, said no to being enlisted into the U.S. military. Subsequently, refused to be drafted. Now, this was the war in Vietnam. The draft was still going on at that time. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of U.S. citizens were drafted into that uh, conflict that we looked at in Chapter 7. Muhammad Ali took a stance against that, being kind of the head of the anti war, non combative movement. Because of that, he lost his title as the heavyweight champion, was not able to earn a living for a number of years as far as a boxing fighter. Okay. And he wasn't able to regain his ability to fight for about 3 or 4 years. Okay. So basically, the prime of his career, from about 1967 until 1970, he was not allowed to fight. And so, this would be an example of a citizen responding to an event and taking action. Now, people that would be supportive of the U.S. government and the containment policy that they were practicing during that time period were very against what Muhammad Ali had done. Um, However, there were a number of individuals, people that supported him. And historically, when you look back at what Muhammad Ali, he did take a stand, certainly against what he thought was wrong. So, anyways, those videos are there. This video here just deals kind of from a more right wing perspective about dodging the draft. And this is just kind of a look at how good Muhammad Ali was as a boxer. So, was he ultimately a coward, or was he a conscientious objector? Okay, like I said, look on the links if you want to examine a little bit further. So, ultimately, what is acceptable during times of war? Can a nation force its citizens into mandatory service for the country? I guess the answer to that question simply is yes, they can. They can force you to do whatever they can, in order to, in their view, protect their sovereignty. Now, I suppose the other question comes: what can a citizen do to reject that principle or reject that, um, control by the government. Okay, so can a nation force its citizens? Well, they have historically. Even democracies force their citizens into mandatory service, and certainly so do dictatorships. This is a video clip that talks about the Mandatory Services Act that Canada had ever since World War I. And I think this would be the decision why they instituted conscription in World War I. Basically, they were fighting over in Europe over 2 or 3 years. Their numbers had started to decline. Enlistment was down. I mean, there's just so many people that want to enlist, and then once you run out of those people that are willing to enlist, then you, according to the government, would have to start conscripting them. So that video kind of describes that part of our history. Now, this is just an example we looked at in Chapter 11, the War Measures Act being an example of the government curtailing our freedoms for the sake of collective security. Okay. And I think we're starting to see quite a bit of that today with a lot of the mandates being passed down, because of what's going on with the COVID-19 pandemic that is occurring throughout the world, how governments are, suppressing people's liberties and freedoms for the sake of collective security, and the many questions that surround that. All right, so how would you reform the War Measures Act? Now, as you might know, and I think I talked about this in Chapter 11, the War Measures Act was gotten rid of in the late 1980s and actually replaced by the Emergencies Act. So as you might remember, the War Measures Act, the existence of war, invasion, insurrection. Insurrection just means that people within the country are trying to take it over, okay, whether that's real or apprehended. Now, the October crisis from the previous slide, there was a belief that the FLQ, if left unchecked, would have eventually tried to set up what was called, and this was from Trudeau's own words at the time, a parallel government that was in contrast to the Quebec and perhaps the Canadian governments. And so the War Measures Act was instituted to stop those type of events. So it was eventually replaced by the Emergencies Act in 1988. The big difference between the War Measures Act, which is basically an act of the executive branch, is that the Emergencies Act has to be a declaration of an emergency by the cabinet, must be reviewed by Parliament. Okay, so it has to be supported by not just the executive branch, but also the legislative branch. So, and like I said, I'm not getting into the nitty gritty and how they can get around it, but in the wording of it, at least 2 branches of government have to be okay with it before it can be passed. And then there's a couple of other big differences. Any temporary laws made under the Emergencies Act are also subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that came into fruition in 1982. So let's look at these Emergencies Act. Once again, you can look at the link. These are wonderful links. I think I make really, really good slide presentations. I must admit, a lot of times I find what some other teachers have done, but then I add to them or I adapt them to make them fit me. But once again, I think I spent a lot of time making these meaningful. Okay. Now, there's different levels of the Emergencies Act, and that's the other big difference between that and the War Measures Act. There's various levels of emergency. So number 1 here is public welfare emergency. Severe natural disasters, major accidents affecting public welfare, which are beyond the capacity or authority of a province or territory to handle. So, for example, I believe the flooding that occurred in Alberta a few years might have fallen under this number 1. Number 2, the public order emergencies. security threats that are beyond the capacity or authority of a province or territory to handle. So you have graduated level 2. The third level is international emergencies, intimidation, coercion, or the use of serious force or violence that threatens the sovereignty, security, or territorial integrity of Canada or any of its allies. And then the fourth and most emergent section is war emergencies, war or other armed conflict, real or imminent, involving Canada or any of its allies. So, like I said, the two biggest differences between the War Measures Act and this Emergencies Act that came in 1988 is one, the Emergencies Act has to go through Parliament, and two, it has a graduated level of emergencies. And so you don't always have to invoke it to the highest level like you did with the War Measures Act. All right. Section 2, how has the Emergencies Act made pandemics and water shortages a threat to our democratic values? From the January 2010 diploma exam, this was actually the source. Rights and freedoms are essential to a democracy. However, there may be times when a temporary suspension of rights and freedoms is necessary to guarantee the preservation of society. Okay. This could be an excellent source that I could give you for kind of your final source analysis. I mean, and more than likely, if I do give this one, I'll have an accompanying video to it. But, once again, have a look at that. What perspective is that? Is that completely free? Is that completely dictatorial? Is it somewhere in the middle? Okay. And so you need to ask yourself, to what extent do I embrace the perspective or perspectives found within the source? Okay. I liken it to a person. I like this person for this reason and that reason, but there might be something about that person I don't like. Okay. What's that? Okay. How much do I want to hang out with that said person, etc.? Same thing with this statement. I like that aspect of it. I like that aspect of it, but I might not like that part of it. So, as you think about that source, what contemporary case studies would we likely research in order to better understand this issue? Well, let's look at what's going on right now, okay, with COVID. I mean, that's certainly a wonderful contemporary case study that you could have an opinion on, that certainly this source has an opinion on. Okay. You could look at the October crisis. You could look at September 11th and the subsequent passing of the Patriot Act in the United States that we looked at in Chapter 11. Lots of things. All right, we have Martin Luther King. So we're just kind of turning the page here. Martin Luther King was a civil rights advocate in the 1950s and 1960s. Certainly, he had a vision of citizenship. I strongly recommend that you spend about 20 to 30 minutes listening to his I Have a Dream speech and thinking, what is his vision of citizenship? What is his vision of equality? Okay. And contrast that with some of the things that you hear going on in our world today. And how would Martin Luther King actually see the world of today and some of the subsequent problems that are occurring, not only in our country, but in the United States and throughout the world? Last few slides here, we talk about different attempts at democratization throughout various exemplar countries. The first one here is the so-called Orange Revolution that occurred in the former Soviet country of the Ukraine. And like I said, go ahead and watch those links. Okay. But this would be an example of people rising up and saying, we do not want to be oppressed. We don't want to be controlled. We don't want to be told what to do, etc. We want our freedom. Now, I would argue that perhaps events like this, they might seem grassroots in their nature, might, in my words, be a little astroturfish in nature, but I digress a little bit. Okay, think about who benefits for this occurring, etc. Okay, but certainly this is an exemplar of people taking citizenship and citizen action in order to invoke a change within their country. Another case study that you could certainly look at is what happened in South Africa all the way up until the 1990s with the ending of the apartheid, the uh, discrimination against the African majority that occurred in South Africa from, I believe, the 1940s all the way up until the late 80s, early 90s. Okay, you could look at that. The whole idea of segregation, the whole idea of preferential treatment towards one group over another. The case study you looked at in grade 10 with Gandhi and the British control of India, subsequently Gandhi using his charisma and his ability to gain support eventually gave India its independence. Okay, but once again, that was a grassroots organization that eventually led to the British leaving India in 1947 and the creation of the two new nations of India and Pakistan. And then there's other protest movements that you could look at, people taking citizenship action. During the Vietnam War, there were a ton of protests. Okay, I think the clip I have is from the movie Forrest Gump, etc. The civil rights movement that occurred, like I said, when I was previously talking about Martin Luther King, from the 1950s all the way up until the late 1960s, culminating in the passage of the Civil Rights Acts, I believe, by President Johnson. The ongoing women's rights movements, women's suffrage, the right to vote that happened in the early part of the 20th century, the equal rights amendments that were attempted in the United States throughout the 1970s, 80s, etc. And then the other ones here. More contemporary examples would be like you saw with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and then the spring uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya. Last couple of videos. This is a I Pledge video. This was a video made by a bunch of Hollywood celebrities during the campaign of Barack Obama back in 2008. Basically telling the world in their own special way what they pledged to do, as American citizens. Okay, so in one way, I show this video is kind of a look at this is what you can do to make your country better. Since I've seen about 20 more of these type of videos in the last 10 to 15 years, in some ways, it's some would argue. I'm not saying that I would argue this, but a certain amount of virtue signaling. Okay. Anyhow, end off this is a nice little video that deals with human rights, the evolution of human rights, and where do we go from here as far as human rights. Once again, if you want to watch these videos, go on to the actual slide lesson itself and click the subsequent links. Sometimes watching these videos beats reading the textbook, though I do strongly recommend the textbook. All right, to end off, you see the chapter 13, 14 terms. Go through these again. Make sure that you know the difference between jus soli, jus sanguinis, positive, negative human rights. I don't know if I talked about all of them, but you can certainly look them up. Philanthropy is what people do in order to help out people. So wealthy people. Right now, what's going on in the United States is there's a lot of private organizations trying to help out people that have been affected by the economic downturn in the United States. One guy that I follow specifically, his name is Dave Portnoy from Barstool Sports. He's raised so far about $14 million from private donations to help businesses try to make their way through the next few months while this lockdown continues. So that would be an example of philanthropy. Okay. Anyhow, liberation movements just means trying to obtain more freedom. Civil disobedience is one way in which people try to bring about more rights and freedoms. Okay. So, sit-ins, okay, would be an example of civil disobedience. Mass strikes would be civil disobedience, etc. Anyhow, I think that's about it. I'll probably make a few more videos just because, well, by the way, I got this new toy for Christmas. It is a microphone, not an overly expensive microphone, but I wanted to sound a little bit better. Now, God gave me my voice, and I can only do so much for the voice itself. But I think with the new technological tool here, the microphone, I think I sound at least a little bit better, and my voice is a little bit fuller. But I digress. Anyway, I probably won't attach an assignment to the chapter 13-14 section. This is just for you to listen. I'll probably make a few more videos, but anyhow, I think that's the last slide. Take care, people.